Hello, this is Lady Boulay, and I hope you're having a marvelous day and that you're looking forward to the new year 2023. Thank you for your support. Thank you for subscribing to the channel. Thank you for your thumbs up, for your comments, and thank you for sharing the videos. Thank you for all you do to support the channel. Well, today I am going to go back into history and talk about a subject that's so deep in our culture that it goes all the way back to the days of bondage that we call the slave days. Days that we are not going to get over, and we are not going to forget, and we are not going to stop talking about it. And I, along with many other African Americans, wish people who are not of our lineage, of our culture, would stop trying to give us advice about getting over slavery, because we are not going to get over it. That's history. You don't get over your history. You absorb your history. So we are not going to get over it, okay? And what I'm going to ask such people to do is to stay out of our business. We are not in your country or your tribe, around your people, trying to tell you what you ought to do, and you are not going to tell us what to do. Stay out of our business. So the title of this video is The History of Watch Meeting. Some people call it watch night, watch service, but watch meeting goes all the way back to 1862. By 1862, Africans had been enslaved in the United States for 307 years or 243 years, depending on who you're listening to. Some people say that the first enslaved people came in 1555, but the United States government says the first slave ship came in 1619, which would have made it 243 years of Africans being enslaved in America. So 243 years of free labor was quite a run for America, and 307 years was even better. So it was time for something to be done, and everybody knew that, except the South. The South, those southern states that were really benefiting from the slave labor, did not want to let go of their slaves because they had made those people rich. Those enslaved people had made the South and the southern white men rich. So naturally, he did not want to give up his, what he called, property. But the time had come for it to end. And so a civil war then started in 1861. The South called themselves the Confederate States, and the North was the United States of America. Now, the United States of America should have won that war hands down, but they did not have the fighting spirit that the South had, even though they had superior manpower and superior weapons. But the South was giving them a run for their money. And from 1861 until 1862, September of 1862, the South was running all over the North. But in 1862, there was a battle in Maryland. It was near the town of Sharpsburg, that they also called the Battle of Antietam. That was when the North finally was able to hold its own against the South. And Lincoln wanted to do something very quickly to rally the spirit of the troops, to make them more determined to win. So they had to do something to rally the troops and build the morale of the Union Army, or the Army of the United States. So he and his cabinet came up with the idea of the Emancipation Proclamation. And what it said was, it was only going to free the slaves that were in the states that were fighting against the United States. There were 4 states that had slaves, but they were not fighting against the United States. That was Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, and Missouri. They had slaves in those states, but they were not fighting against the United States. So Lincoln said, I'm going to leave those slaves alone. They won't be free. So we can see that he wasn't really all that concerned about freeing the slaves. He was concerned about saving the Union and getting those southern states back into the United States. But he had to do something to make that happen. So he said that he was going to free the slaves in the South. These are the slaveholding states that left the United States and formed the Confederate States of America. So if you have family members that lived in South Carolina, Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Louisiana, North Carolina, Texas, Tennessee, Virginia, or Arkansas, then your family members would have been freed under the Emancipation Proclamation, because those were the states fighting against the United States. But if your family members were enslaved in these states, and they're called border states, Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, and Missouri, those states did not leave the United States. So those slaves would have stayed enslaved. They would not have been freed. Now, it seems like it would have been the other way around, but it's not. Lincoln was trying to upset the South, the states that were fighting against him. So he knew that the best way to get back at them was to free those slaves. But because he did not want to upset the slave holders in the border states, he told them, you can keep your slaves. So these slaves would not have been freed under the Emancipation Proclamation. So on September the 22nd of 1862, Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, and the third paragraph was the important one. It said, on the first day of January, in the year of our Lord, 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be then thenceforth and forever free, and the executive government of the United States, including the military and naval authority thereof, will recognize and maintain the freedom of such persons, and will do no act or acts to repress such persons or any of them in any efforts they may make for their actual freedom. So this is the important part of the Emancipation Proclamation. He is saying that anybody that is being held as a slave in a state where those people are fighting against the United States of America is free. And that's all they needed to hear. That was the answer to the prayers they had been praying since they got to the shores of North America. This was the answer. It is important for us to note that this was an executive order. So an executive order is not binding legislation. An executive order is only as good as the president that issues it. When a new president comes into office, he can repeal that executive order. So the next president after Lincoln could have come back and repealed the Emancipation Proclamation, and those people would have had to go back into slavery. It took the Congress of the United States to pass the 13th Amendment, which is binding legislation. That is what it took to actually free not only the slaves that were in states where they were fighting the United States, but all of the slaves. The 13th Amendment freed all of them. But for today, we're just talking about the Emancipation Proclamation. And the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect on January 1st of 1863, New Year's Day of 1863. But the celebration began on December 31st of 1862. In 2022, it is not possible for us to imagine what hearing those words would have sounded like 160 years ago. But these images give us an idea about how happy those people must have been. Just the thought of being free, of being away from the brutality, of the hard work, of the uncertainty of family, just having somebody else having total control over your life and not knowing from day to day what it was going to be like. There's no way we can imagine it, but we try. But they lived it, and this is what's left behind. On the night of December 31st, 1862, enslaved and free African Americans gathered, many in secret, to ring in the new year and await news that the Emancipation Proclamation had taken effect. Just a few months earlier, on September 22nd, 1862, President Abraham Lincoln issued the executive order that declared enslaved people in the rebelling Confederate States legally free. However, the decree would not take effect until the clock struck midnight at the start of the new year. The occasion, known as Watch Night or Freedom's Eve, marks when African Americans across the country watched and waited for the news of freedom. So they gathered in the woods, because most of them gathered in the woods, and they watched the sky. Because of their own knowledge of the sky and the stars and the activities that were going on in the sky, they knew when one day was ending and another day was beginning. So they watched and they waited and they prayed and they sang and they danced, but most of all, they watched the night sky. This spirit is still visible in Watch Night services today. The Watch Night service typically begins around 7 o'clock on December 31st and lasts through midnight as faith leaders guide their members in praise and worship. Many churches across the nation bow in prayer minutes before the midnight hour as they sang out, "Watchman, watchman, please tell me the hour of the night." In return, the minister replies, "It is 3 minutes to midnight. It is 1 minute before the new year, and it is now midnight. Freedom has come to bless this transition into the new year." So watch service is still active and allowed in many communities in the United States, and we remember our ancestors. We've heard stories of that dreadful experience, but of that celebratory night when they came together and worshiped and sang and danced and prayed and waited until freedom came at last. And that is what we call Watch Night. And that is why we still do it, because we do it to remember and we do it to honor our ancestors. And at the end of the video, I'm going to leave some scenes from the watch service from days of old and from today's services. And the legacy of African Americans continues. I wish you a very happy and prosperous new year, and thank you so much for your support.